Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Maria, for a very interesting presentation. I'm actually part of the 17 Rooms initiative from Brookings and Rockefeller Foundation, which is the 17 SDGs, so found that fascinating. So good morning, everyone. I'm talking to you from actually Southern California, and it's a New Zealand accent if you're wondering. The Development Partner Institute is an organized non-profit that I founded with Mark Kutafani, the CEO of Anglo American, 5 years ago after 3 years of work at the Kellogg Innovation Network out of the Kellogg School of Management. And we'll talk a little bit more. You'll get a sense for the DPI, which is really a multi-stakeholder platform to reimagine the mining industry from being an extractive business model to one of being a true development partner. And to your point, Maria, that's about economic, social, and environmental prosperity for all. What we're talking about today is our responsible sourcing initiative and why a whole value chain approach to responsible sourcing not only makes sense, but is actually the only way to achieve that. And let's talk about what that looks like, what that is. Let me move my slide. So the purpose of the Responsible Sourcing Coalition that we formed in 2019 is to accelerate the creation of a whole of value chain response. And really, as I mentioned, is to move the mining industry and use this as an impetus to go from an extractive model to a true development partner that streamlines first customer efforts and action. By customers, we mean people at the end of the value chain that are the ultimate users of metals and minerals. Be able to accommodate commodity and regional differences, but also very importantly, balances the value, burden, and capability of these initiatives across key members of the value chain. And in particular, we're talking here about the communities and Indigenous people that often do not have a voice at the table. This is an initiative that we are doing in partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation. So that's very important. And this aligns well with their key mission, which is to really bring people out of poverty around the world. And we're very delighted to have the support specifically for this initiative from Schneider Electric and Rio Tinto. So let's talk about a little bit more about what we mean by whole of value chain. So these are the organizations that are involved in this initiative, which started, you'll see in a journey map in late 2019. So we have a major brands from the miners, the suppliers to the industry and fabricators. So it includes BHP, Rio Tinto, Anglo American, AngloGold Ashanti, and many more. Consumer-facing companies, critically investors, both long-term investors like Hermes, big investment banks are representing debt and equity, academia, NGOs, faith, and Indigenous people. And when we've convened these people, it's often the very first time that they have actually been in a room together and listened. And we'll talk about why the benefits of whole of value chain is important. So Paul Polman, who used to be the CEO of Unilever, said the only way to get change in any one segment of a value chain is to get the entire value chain participating. And insofar as we know, this is a fairly unique initiative in bringing these people together in a multitude of ways. So what's the journey look like? So November 2019, interesting timing actually, we convened about 25 multi-stakeholder leaders at the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center, which is actually on Lake Bellagio on Lake Como in Italy. And we are actually convened in a 15th century former Cistercian monk monastery, which was very inspiring. And from that initiative came a series of actions, which because of COVID resulted in over a 15-month period, multi-stakeholder sprints. And this was bringing different stakeholder groups together, either entirely as whole of value chain. And recently we had, for example, investors with community members, Indigenous people from around the world, as well as with consumer-facing companies. And really what it is about building trust, creating the challenging conversations that people don't really want to have. And the next steps is really to now move into continuing the dialogue, but also taking specific actions towards this. And what I'm talking about here is not actually about standards. And we'll talk about that in a little bit in a minute. So often people ask us, what are the drivers for responsible sourcing? So first is consumers and the companies that face consumers. So if you notice from the slide, we have people like BMW, General Motors, Tiffany's, and Microsoft involved. And they are very specific in that they want to be able to, at some point in the future, be able to put a label, if you like, on their products and say, these are responsibly sourced. And often that raises the question, what does that mean? So there's obviously the climate change, emissions aspect, human rights, no harm to communities by any actions. So they are driving very strongly to have that happen and pushing it up the value chain. Investor activism, which we all know about, and that's also both from the equity markets and the people that issue debt. And I think that's gaining a significant amount of momentum. And then the social license issues, that miners need to be true development partners. I think another thing that's really driving this responsible sourcing now is, as the world starts a renewed push into a net zero emissions world, is the IEA for the first time published a report on the metal minerals demands for the key electrical metals, copper, cobalt, lithium, nickel, etc. And the need of production in the next 30 years is like 20-fold increase in tonnage across these metals. So how the mining industry can responsibly mine an unprecedented scaling of the production, I think is a real challenge. And I think that's complicated actually by record prices that they're receiving at the moment. Because often when industries are awash in profits and free cash flow, it actually diminishes the imperative to act on other things that other people in society may deem important. So I think there's conflicting pressures on the industry. So very interesting. So some of the key insights from the work so far is, this is staggering. We stopped the research, but right now the mining industry has 52 responsible sourcing standards and counting. In fact, we counted over 100. These include everything from broad standards like SASB and GRI, but through to very specific mining standards, responsible steel, there's responsible cobalt, there's responsible aluminium, and it just goes on and on. One of the key insights was that the consumer-facing companies like the auto manufacturers go, we have 14 critical metals and minerals. We can't have 14 standards. You need to adopt one standard. And the industry response is, well, we need to be able to cater for the different commodity and regional differences. So there needs to be kind of a rationalization around that, which I think is really, really important. And our initiative is not about getting to a single standard. It's about developing action, because our firm belief is that we can have action and transparency before we get to a specific standard. So there's progress being made, but we need to accelerate that and match the needs of the different stakeholders. The Indigenous and community representatives, there's a phrase, we need to put the I into ESG, and that is I for Indigenous. This is really quite missing. So the First Nations in Canada group did a research project recently and looked at the top 15 sustainability initiatives or standards like GRI, SASB, and so on. And Indigenous people were only mentioned twice in two standards, once in GRI and once in SASB, in a very small way. So, and there's a lot of unattended consequences. And a lot of the consumer-facing companies now are also saying it's not sufficient for us to know from our ultimate suppliers that there's no harm being done to Indigenous people or communities, that we need full visibility through to the communities and Indigenous people where mines are located. And also investors are starting to take those positions as well. So there's a greater push for transparency throughout the value chain. One of the other key insights is a common language, understanding, and purpose. There's real disconnects, particularly between all the business people who speak really in technocrat language, miners, investors, etc., and communities, Indigenous people that really speak in human terms and in stories. And there's a great void and gap in terms of understanding. So that really needs to be deepened. And really about deepening that human connection, because I think once you get people in the room, people lose their organizational armor. And the other thing is really a deepened understanding of what a supply chain really is and each role member in the value or supply chain. Because again, we're finding that people don't have a full as an understanding as you may expect them to have. I mean, obviously the consumer-facing companies do, but other participants don't have as deep an understanding. So what's next for us? We're going to continue our discussions because change happens, as we say, one person, one organization, one engagement at a time. So we'll continue to build this mutual understanding and trust via these multi-stakeholder dialogues that will continue globally and hopefully be back in person by early next year. We are going to publish a couple of position papers in the next 3 to 4 months around a couple of the tough issues that have really been surfaced during the previous sprints. that we really hope will catalyze a broad-based global discussion on some of these tough issues and continue to build unexpected partnerships. One of the actions that came out, interestingly, was one of those investor groups had really not a lot of visibility into communities. And I fast forward 18 months, they were very focused on climate change issues. They've taken an increased interest in communities and have in fact just hired an Indigenous person to be a community manager inside the investment firm to help them understand more the needs and impacts on communities, Indigenous people globally by the mining industry. So that's really a quick tour of the RESCO initiative. These 7 slides are really an accumulation of an enormous amount of work from the DPI team, which is global, as well as all the different organizations that you see listed there. So Sarah and Rose and everyone, thank you for the opportunity to talk about this initiative. I don't know if I gave it justice in this quick sprint, but happy to take any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Peter. And you certainly did do it justice. So ladies and gentlemen, from behind your muted microphones, a massive round of applause for the fantastic Peter Bryant. So brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Peter. And just while the questions are coming in on Q&A, in the chat, on YouTube, etc. Peter, you mentioned that, so there are 52 different standards,
yes,
and that might be vaguely applicable and counting. And of course, the trick is almost that pleading with the world not to invent any more standards, please, but help us navigate through them. Do you have any tips on how to navigate that forest of standards?
That's a great question. I mean, there's a huge complexity. So I think a couple of things are happening. One is each of the standards are trying to rationalize themselves. So there's starting to be more collaboration between them. I think, I mean, it gets back to actually a little bit of what Maria said. I think, there's some standards that you can adopt, but also at the same time, I think standards may not be enough. I think companies need to say, based on my own values, these are the things I will do that will often exceed a standard. And I'll provide full transparency. And I think there's enough initiatives around the world, like Bloomberg, that are testing companies are they doing what they say they will do and reporting that out. So I think that kind of more almost voluntary enforcement mechanisms combined with transparency will help a lot more until we get to standards. So because I think if you try and grapple with standards, it just gets too complex. It does. Everybody just kind of gets tired. So that would be my advice, actually.
So just with that, and there's a great question that's come in from Amanda, and she asks, are there any examples of other industries that have this same kind of wide array of standards and how they have managed to converge those standards successfully?
Actually, it's interesting. Yeah, this is pretty unique, actually. So there are some great initiatives. So the auto industry, and people always argue these are good or bad. So they had a great initiative around rubber, actually. Where they collapsed all the standards. So all the auto companies got together with the tire companies and actually collapsed into a single standard around rubber. So as one, and I think some of the food commodities are likewise, with cocoa and coffee. So I think, food commodities can often be the place to look for more advancing. And the other complication too, Sarah, is you've got SASB, GRI, and now you've got the World Economic Forum trying to rationalize all those into a single standard. So it's, until the market kind of dictates one that everybody has to follow. So it's tough.
And do you think that, I mean, obviously there's a reason why each of these 52 standards has been written, and often the purpose of the standard is actually something quite different to what somebody might then need to use it for. There's a question here from John Clark that's come in over the Q&A, and he says, well, shouldn't government be setting these standards? What do you think about that, Peter?
Ooh, yeah, it's interesting. Actually, I always go back, surprising, I'm an accountant by profession way back a long time ago, but I think you just follow how accounting standards have evolved, right? And so people wanted to have full trust in the financial information that companies disclosed, right? So eventually, through independent bodies, those standards were set, and then audit. And the key is auditing, right? And then who audits those? So, because the key thing is the ability to compare and contrast companies. How do I know BHP is doing better than Vale or better than Anglo? I don't know, I think governments can. I don't think government should set the standards. I think it's too slow, but I think they can provide impetus and maybe kind of direction and guardrails. I always say versus setting them themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, that's something as well where we heard yesterday a little bit about mining codes, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess you've got the purpose for those standards, and then you get standards and standards. There's almost the regulation stuff that often comes along behind. And then actually what is a company doing internally, which always talks to your point earlier of saying, well, no, our values are this, so therefore we're going to meet that.
Exactly, yeah.
So with this as well, Peter, I mean, you mentioned that out of all of those different standards, only 2 of them vaguely mentioned Indigenous people. Is that none of them used the words Indigenous peoples, but referred to that group of people in a different way, or they just totally excluded them?
No, silent on communities. So GRI mentioned, so it was a combination of, they're looking for all references to community, Indigenous people, whatever. So it wasn't just Indigenous. GRI mentioned, for example, you have no problem with communities if you have no legal lawsuits with them. So the communities, Indigenous people are really, because they're being managed as a risk. That's the problem. So versus partners. So, and I think that's a real wrestling match. And in this world of increased transparency and engagement, I think Indigenous people's voices are rising, and they want resource development done in a responsible way, but in a way that drives their prosperity. And it's difficult because there's just so many different community representatives, different tribes, depending on what countries you are. So it's complicated, but that doesn't mean it should be ignored. So.
It is indeed complicated. And I think this is something here where all the way through this conference, we are really, really excited to have a whole wide range of speakers. I mean, including the next speakers who are upcoming in a second, to actually delve into that really complex yet exciting world of the social aspects and trying to understand communities a bit better. And I know that Catherine's going to be leading on a session at the end of today that dives into that in a bit more detail. So with that, Peter, you mentioned that hopefully later on this year, you're going to be going back to face-to-face events, bringing together all of those different stakeholders. Do you have online things in the meantime, or is it really focusing in on writing those papers?
I know we have online, so we do what we call sprints online. So we're doing those about every 6 to 7 weeks now with different combinations. So we have later in June, we're bringing all that whole of value chain back together after we've done a series of kind of, one stakeholder group with another and bringing those findings back. So yeah, and I think everybody's very engaged to kind of accelerate, because we're charting a path that's very different to a lot of the other, kind of standards-based initiatives. So yeah, so we're excited.
Really exciting.
It is very.
And I am seeing, as we do actually have time available, I think you're obviously being very concise with your answers, Peter, because this is glorious. We can get through loads of questions here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Brilliant. I'm used to this.
Rukia, and apologies if I have mispronounced your name, asks us, how can we prevent unauthentic representation of responsible value chains, i.e. how we sometimes occasionally see greenwashing within industry? So how can we try and prevent that?
Wow, big question. Yeah, so that's a huge question.
60 seconds, starting now.
30 seconds, yes. That's really hard. So I think three comments there. One is the consumer-facing brands like Tiffany's, BMW, Microsoft, they have pretty strong procurement checking, So I think where they have shifted from is not just only checking their direct suppliers, but they want way more visibility all the way back in the value chain. So that's one check. And they'll call out their suppliers. 2 is, I think, those kind of voluntary initiatives like Bloomberg, calling out companies. And their recent program, I think they said about 30% of companies are meeting what they said, about 30% are kind of on the way, and 30% are just not walking the talk. So that's the third one. And I think then companies themselves just have to be very transparent and honest about the challenges. So I think it's important to have aspirations and to say, Mark Cutifani is very good at this. This is what I want to do. I know the path to these things, but we're kind of figuring out the path to these. I just don't know. And I think that's the best way to do. And I think corporations really struggle in showing vulnerability and saying, we actually don't have the answers to these aspirations yet, but we're working on it. So, and I think that until we get to this auditing world, there's no perfect way to answer that question, unfortunately.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Peter. And actually, I think there's going to be certainly some more talks later on the week in terms of that turning monitoring into actual metrics, etc. as well. So where we are checking up on different bits of the supply chain and who should be doing it as well. So of course, at the moment, there's a massive reliance on the mining company saying, hey, this is what we're doing. And everybody just having to believe that, which is fine. But then also there are other data sets, of course, that we can get hold of that then says, okay, what's really going on in that context, which helps the mining companies as well. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the fabulous Peter Bryant. Thank you very much, Peter.
And anybody can email me if they want to with questions.
Fantastic, Peter.